I'm Annie Stanton. Ooh, I am a special education teacher and program support teacher for Menasha Joint School District.
You can see a pretty great group, huh, Scott? I think I muted you. There we go. Can you try it again?
Yes, can you hear me okay now? I still have a lot of background noise on my end. If I could be rude and just exit out for a second and enter back in and see if I can fix it, I apologize to the group. Hear me okay? Okay. How's that for good first impressions? I already had to exit the meeting. Thanks for your patience, everybody.
Well, Scott,
Steve, I didn't want to interrupt if you were still chatting about something.
that's so kind of you, Scott. I think we are eager to hear your thoughts. Our team has been reading about school finance, and we had a primer yesterday. A couple of questions came to mind during that experience. We also know that many of those questions are likely going to be answered through your PowerPoint presentation. I have forwarded a copy of that to everyone through the chat. But if you wanted to, while you're working through this, to share your screen, they do have the capacity to do that. Or if you'd like me to, I'd be more than happy to do that too, Scott.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I'll share my screen, and if it's up and going fine, I'll tell you, you will all laugh at me because you're probably much more tech savvy than I am. But we use Google Meet so often that, I don't even think about it. But usually when I'm on Zoom, I'm on your end taking in information, not the one actually presenting. So this is a good experience for me. So I appreciate your patience. Before I get started, just a couple of connections. So Kristen, did you say that you were in Menasha?
Yeah, me and Annie are both Menasha.
Yes. Okay. Very good. Thank you. So I grew up in Appleton. So
Nice.
when I hear Fox Valley, that always, my eyes get big when I hear that. And Ryan, you mentioned you were in Sauk at the high school?
Yep, I'm at Sauk Prairie.
Okay. So after I got my business degree like 100 years ago, I went back to school to Edgewood College to get my education credits to become a business ed teacher. And when I was at Edgewood getting my education credits, they sent me, now I wasn't familiar with the Madison area, but they gave me directions to go out to Sauk, to go to the high school. There was a gentleman by the name of George Roth. I don't know if you've ever heard that name, but he was a business ed teacher. Again, this is way a long time ago. And George was a wonderful mentor for me as I started navigating the world of business education. And eventually, a year later, I got my job at Monona Grove High School being a business ed teacher. So anytime I hear business ed, especially Sauk, it brought back memories from decades ago. So anyway, that dates me a little bit, but welcome everyone. Thanks for having me this morning. School finance is an interesting topic, especially for people that don't necessarily have maybe an interest in being in the business office, being a business manager. But as I always say, regardless of the industry you work in, whether it's education, the corporate world, et cetera, it's always valuable to have a bit of an understanding of how, the organization operates as a business, because whether we're a principal, we're in curriculum, we're in special education, Steve, superintendent, whatever the case might be, there's always some connection to the business office. And it's not just because of payroll, for it's lots of reasons, buying things, purchasing things, budgeting. So you may or may not already have your fingers in the budget a little bit, depending on your role and where you work. But nevertheless, I do think it's important that, again, even if you may not ever find yourself calculating a revenue limit in the state of Wisconsin for a public school, it's important for you to at least be a little bit familiar, I think, with some of the variables that really define what our budgets look like. And so my hope today is not necessarily to make you passionate about calculating revenue limits and tax levies and all of that. But I think it is important for you to at least become a bit familiar and to have some good dialogue. I don't have the opportunity to sit in every one of your classes to hear what it is you're talking about, but you know, there's a history of public school finance throughout the entire country, yet alone in every individual state where they do operate quite differently. So I can't say that I'm savvy in knowing all the logistical business practices in, let's say, a neighboring district like Illinois or Minnesota. But what I can say is that at least for the state of Wisconsin, where most of us currently are, I do think it's important to at least have a little bit of background. And I remember being a business ed teacher at Monona Grove, just on the surface, thinking to myself, who in the world thought of all these archaic account codes? You know, there's number after number after number, and there's an object and a function. And I just kept thinking to myself, who thought of this? And as I explored going down this road of school business management, it made me realize that it's actually something that the Department of Public Instruction, DPI, actually requires all of us to administer in our local districts. So as I started navigating into the school business world, I started to realize, oh, that's why we do things the way we do things. Somebody wasn't just sitting in the Monona Grove business office coming up with some of these systems. It was actually something that we were expected to follow. So enough said there. So just real quick, a little background about me. So I had mentioned that I was a business ed teacher at Monona Grove for about 7 years. Toward the latter part of my experience there, I began the school business management program in the master's level at UW-Whitewater. I'm trying to think the year that I graduated from it. I want to say it was 2003. And at that time, I started my first business manager position in Poinnette Schools, just kind of northwest of Madison. I was there for 6.5 years, and then I had the opportunity to move much closer to home and start in Mount Horeb. So a little bit about me. I truly treasure the opportunities that I had to work in a classroom. It's been many years since I've been in a classroom, but I have to say that in any administrative position, the opportunities that you have to be able to be in a school building, working with kids, working with parents, et cetera, is such a valuable experience. That's just a little bit of background about me. I have a PowerPoint, as Steve mentioned, that I'm going to share on the screen. I would strongly encourage you, don't be polite and wait until the end. If you have a question, you don't have to raise your hand or anything, just shut out and interrupt. As much as I'll be doing a lot of talking, I'm more than happy to make it be a discussion-based opportunity. So excuse me just a second as I pull up my document here. Okay, can everybody see this okay? Thumb up, thank you. Okay, so here we go. So here is my crack at being able to explain in a short period of time some very specific things about school finance in the state of Wisconsin. One of the things that I would encourage you to just keep in mind as we navigate through this is I'll share some things of what Mount Horeb does. It may be just a tinge different than maybe the district that you're currently in, and that's okay. It should be that way. Everybody should operate with what works in their district. But generally speaking, even though there's certain things that Mount Horeb does, it still falls within the confines of what's expected, not only from the state, but also from DPI, who, as you know, sort of oversees a lot of what we do in public schools in the state. So there's three main topics that I'd like to connect with you on today. One is our budget cycle. So you may recall just from your experiences in your job, each year brings its own unique variables when it comes to a school's budget. And obviously, there's a lot of external factors that come into play when we're creating our budgets each and every year. Nevertheless, there's still a budget cycle that we must follow so that we can make sure when school starts that we have a working budget in which to operate in. And I always say when it comes to budgeting, there's sometimes uncomfortable discussions that go along with it. Budgeting is not easy. And when resources are scarce and limited, budgeting becomes even that much more difficult. So when we talk about the budget cycle, we'll talk about the times that we need to pay attention to, the deadlines that we have to pay attention to. And again, to the degree that you can compare some of the things that I share with what goes on in your district, maybe it'll give you some insight as to, oh, okay, that's why my school does it this way. The second one is revenue limits. For those of you that aren't familiar with revenue limits, they're a main driver behind budgets in public schools in the state of Wisconsin. It really defines the amount of revenue that we can bring into our district. And we'll talk more about that here in just a few minutes. And then the last item is our accounting practices. That's getting a little bit more into the weeds. But for those of you that have budgets, either in a classroom, in your office, maybe at a department level or even at a building level, accounting practices, I think, are certainly something that we all need to be aware of and pay attention to. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the accounting practices. I won't get into things like journal entries and debits and credits, although Ryan, you might appreciate that, but I'm not sure how many else will. Questions so far? Okay. So we'll talk about the budget cycle first. So there's 4 variables that I like to think of when we talk about our budget cycle. And the first one is our state biennium budget. So for those of you that may not be aware, the state of Wisconsin operates on a 2-year budget cycle, and we call that the biennium budget. So we are entering the 2nd year of the state's biennium budget. So their cycle is the 21 through 2023 budget. So when we approach the end of this upcoming school year, the state will be concluding its 2-year biennium. And I would say once we turn over the calendar year into early 2023, we'll start to see things come out of the city of Madison about the 23-25 biennium budget. And certainly there's a lot of political items that are tied to a state budget, including, the gubernatorial race that's going on currently and what happens as a result of the election in November. Nevertheless, again, important for us to know that we are entering a new, after this school year, a 23-25 biennium budget. What it causes us to do, and I have a little picture of a calendar there, what it really causes us to do as school districts is we need to start forecasting what our budget might look like for the next year and sometimes in the next 2 years. But it's challenging to do because until the state adopts its new biennium budget, and again, they'll be working on that probably, we'll hear a lot more in January, February, March of 23. But as we conclude the end of the school year, we'll start to hear a lot about what budgets look like for public schools. We really do operate on a lot of projections. In fact, we're spending money now. July 1st started. Our fiscal year runs July 1st through June 30th. And when July 1st rolls around, principals are ordering materials, teachers are ordering materials. We're paying bills to keep the lights on and keep the air conditioning going. And even though we're spending money in our budget, there's a lot of projections right now even that help us make our budget for this upcoming school year. So it's a long way of saying we spend money in this industry before we actually know our official budgets, which really are not determined until we get to the end of October. So projections are really important in our world. Important dates, the second item on the slide. So I mentioned that our fiscal year runs July 1st through June 30th. Those are important dates just on the surface. There's a variety of things that your school district would have in place about when people are allowed to spend funds. When you get to the latter part of the school year, they may have a cutoff time. Maybe it's sometime in April or May when the school district says, you know what, we're going to slow down our spending for the year because we're approaching the end of our fiscal year. Needless to say, it's always important to pay attention to the direction where your district goes with budget dates. And I always tell our finance committee, I share a budget calendar with them every single meeting. The funny thing is we meet once a month. There's some school board members on it. Dr. Salerno is on it. I'm on the committee. I share the exact same calendar with them every month, but I do it not because there's changes in the dates. I do it simply because I even want to remind school board members that there's things that we need to make decisions on and deadlines we need to meet in order to accomplish the greater good, which is getting to a balanced budget. So we have something to work off of when the school year starts. So again, just pay attention to important dates because there is rhyme and reason to why they're there. The third one, district practices and procedures. Talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but needless to say, the vast majority of school districts in the state of Wisconsin, from my experience, use a financial software called Skyward. Some of you may have your fingers in Skyward in various things, even if it's just on the payroll side of the house. But if you find yourself in a situation where you're actually managing budgets, Skyward is typically, I think there's close to 400 districts in the state that use Skyward, so the vast majority. And there's practices and procedures that even something like a financial software requires us to follow to make sure that we're doing good things. And the last one is forecasting, and we'll talk about forecasting a little bit more in a moment. But as I mentioned, because we operate so many months in our year on projections, forecasting becomes even more mission critical. And what I mean by forecasting is forecasting out a year, 2, 3 years out and trying to project where you think your budget may land. Typically for public schools in our state, especially the last few years, we typically see some pretty significant deficits in our forecast calculations. And then that gives us pause and it allows us to roll our sleeves up and start making we'll start having some important conversations, not only with staff, but with the board, so that we can get balanced budgets moving forward. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So I mentioned the state biennium budget, 2-year cycles. We run July 1st through June 30th. And I always like to think that the state budget adoption depends on what and when. The what in my world typically means what kind of funding are we going to receive or not receive for the next 2 years? And when I say when, it means when will we actually find out what the budget's going to look like at the state level? Because once the state makes its decisions on how it's going to manage its budget, and it's more than just public schools, right? It's transportation and the whole thing. But when they make their decisions, it then gives us an opportunity to start to hear from a public school point of view, what type of funding the state will or will not be providing us. And we've seen over the years that a state biennium budget can take a long time to adopt, or it can take a fairly quick amount of time. Sometimes many times it depends on the political landscape, who has the majority in the Senate, who has the majority in the Assembly, who's sitting in the governor's chair, what are the priorities at the state level. Sometimes as they start working on the budget at the state level, we might find out before the end of a school year what funding we're going to receive for the next 2 years. And that's fantastic when that happens, because if we can get to the end of a particular school year, and I'll pick on this upcoming school year, we get to the end of school year 22-23, and before teachers are let out and students go home, the state lets us know our funding for 23 through 25, the next 2 years, it's pretty nice going into the summer knowing what we're working with. Many times that's not the case. Many times they will continue to work on the budget well into the summer. In an extreme case, and I've seen it a couple of times in my career, where the state won't adopt its new 2-year budget until September or October. So that means that they've even started their fiscal year without having all their ducks in a row. So then we're really dependent on forecasting because we don't know what we'll receive in funding. And in the business world, it's really, really beneficial, as you can imagine, to know what kind of funding you'll be receiving, because that has a direct impact on what we can do with our expenditures. And so the what's important, of course, how much we're going to be getting in funding. But the when is also significantly important because as I get older, I feel the effects of delayed state budgets and what it means for us as a school district. I'll stop right there and just ask if there's any questions on that category. Okay. So I'm going to throw out a couple important dates here. First is our preliminary budget. So what we do in Mount Horeb is when we roll into the start of a new calendar year, and so I'll pick on this coming January 2023, this upcoming school year, we will start working with our Board of Education and our Finance Committee on projecting a budget for not the current school year, but for the upcoming school year. And it's hard for me to say these dates out loud because boy, does time fly. But we will start working in December and January on the 23-24 budget. And I had a board member one time a few years ago say to me, gosh, Scott, we just took care of our budget for the current school year. And before I even got to take a breath, we're starting to work on our budgeting for the next school year. And I don't say welcome to my world, but it really is something that we sort of have our toe dipped in the water in the current fiscal year, managing what's currently happening, and at the same time another toe dipped into the next year. So a little bit of identity crisis because we're never really just living in the moment in the current budget. We're always looking back and looking forward. So we start working on our preliminary budget at the turn of the calendar year for the upcoming school year, in this case 23-24. And we will have a few board workshops along the way in the winter and spring. That gives the board an opportunity to dive a little bit deeper into some of the details relating to our budget forecasts. Now, when we start working on our preliminary budget for the new year, and the state hasn't adopted its budget yet, as I mentioned before, it's imperative that we feel comfortable with things like, what are we projecting for enrollment for the upcoming year? What are we projecting in terms of health insurance costs and wages and other benefits for our staff? Most of you know this, in a school district, we're a service business. And so when we're a service business, we find in public schools, and I think it's pretty safe to say generally across the board, around 80 to 85% of our entire budget is made up of personnel, which makes sense as a service industry. We're very labor intensive, right? So knowing that our enrollments will have a big impact on our funding, that directly has an impact on forecasting for our expenditures. And it's really important that we absolutely nail down what our personnel costs will look like. Because like I said, the vast majority of our budget is labor. So it's really important that we pay attention to that. As we navigate through the spring and we start to develop a preliminary budget for the new school year, that will take us into our annual meeting. And on my PowerPoint, and you're welcome to do this if you, I know you're all on a computer. If you have an opportunity to go to DPI's website, I'm going to actually go there now You're welcome to follow me just by watching my mouse, but you're also welcome to pull up DPI's website yourself and follow along with me there. So the annual meeting is something that statutorily school districts across the state need to have. Some of you may have been at your annual meetings. When I did an internship at Monona Grove many moons ago, the annual meeting was very interesting. I had not been to one before. There are certain things that a school district is required to accomplish at its annual meeting. And so I thought it might be good to just take a break for a second, go to DPI's website, and I'll just point out to you where you can find some additional information about annual meetings. So you're probably all familiar with DPI's website. Can everybody see DPI's website okay? No? Okay. Let me see if I can.
Scott, I think you have to go in and at the top, you might see share this tab instead, or share this instead, or maybe stop your sharing and then go back in and reshare that tab from DPI. There you are.
Great. So this is the homepage for DPI's website. You've probably been here many times, I would guess, maybe not. There is a specific section in their website just for school finance. So I thought I'd start at the homepage, and then I'm going to go to schools and educators. And then I'm going to scroll down. You'll see these different categories here: licensing, everybody's favorite, assessment and accountability, curriculum and instruction. And we get down to a section called funding and governance. And you'll see a link called school financial services. So in the little world that I live in, this is really my homepage of this site, although I do go to other places as well. And in the school financial services page, you'll see a list of items off on the left side of your screen here. And if I go to accounting, auditing, and financial management, I can get down to a link called budgeting. And here's my cursor, if you can see that. I'm going to click on budgeting. And this is DPI's attempt to inform visitors on things that need to be addressed in the budgeting world. So not that I need to read every word that we have on the screen, but I'll just point out a couple of things. So in the budgeting link, it says the development of a school district's budget is a long-range process. There are several steps, and the individuals involved will need to be vigilant to the process, as new information coming to the school district will often impact the district's overall budget and local levy. And we'll talk about levies here in a little bit. So I'm going to click on that budget link. And they have a series of 7 steps that a school district needs to follow when it's preparing for its annual meeting. Now, one of the most critical items at an annual meeting is a school district's adoption of its budget. And so even though at an annual meeting, there are things that most districts don't know yet. For example, in Mount Horeb, our annual meeting takes place in August. Okay, the school year hasn't started yet in August. So we don't officially know our enrollment until we get to the month of September and school starts. And for those of you that have heard this term, you may have heard of the third Friday count in September. If you've heard of that, that is a date that the state requires school districts to report their enrollment, because there is a direct funding component to a district's enrollment and how much money it will be receiving during the school year. And so in these steps, while I don't intend to go through all the steps, I'll point out just a couple of items here. If we click on step 1, it introduces the development of a proposed budget and what a school district needs to abide by in its annual meeting. And essentially what we do at our annual meeting is we provide the electorate, and for some districts, they may get more attendance than others at an annual meeting. Typically, what we found is if there's a hot pressing item, you may find a few more people join than typical. But on a normal course of the year, I think it's fairly common to not get an overabundance of people that attend an annual meeting. But at an annual meeting, we present our revenues and our expenditures in different budgets. And then after a budget presentation, then the electorate is asked to consider a tax levy. And tax levies are a major financial component that helps support our budget. And so step one talks about exactly that, the information that needs to be shared both in revenues and expenditures. Step two talks a little bit about what we need to post. In other words, how do we inform our public that we're having such a meeting? And so there's some statutory links here for letting a school district know how you post your meeting, when you need to post it, how you post it, how you, again, inform your community that you're having an annual meeting. And then there's a budget component to it. We have to publish in our newspaper our budget projection for the upcoming year so that the public knows what we're looking to spend dollars on. Step three is annual meeting requirements. Again, it gets into a lot of statutory kinds of things. This table is an example of what we put in our newspaper. And what it is we're showing the public what our tax levies have been the last couple of years and what we're projecting our tax levy to look like for the upcoming year. And I'll stop right there and just ask if there's any questions, but I just wanted to point out that on the DPI webpage, there is a place for budgeting, and then it gets into a lot of nitty-gritty detail. But most noteworthy is just there is a place where districts can go and find more information out in the financial world of what needs to show up in an annual meeting booklet. I know that this is not always, exciting and glitter and that kind of thing, but I just want to make sure that you're aware that some of these things are out there for you to take a look at if you ever need to.
Scott, do you think you could tell us when do we typically have annual meetings in our school districts?
Sure. There is information in here that addresses some of the timelines, but generally speaking, from the month of July until the end of October is when a school district will find itself having its annual meeting. I've heard of some school districts that, end of July, they are right on top of having their annual meeting in July. And there's other school districts that will wait all the way till the end of October, sometimes almost the last possible day in October you can have the annual meeting to do it. But again, it's sometime between the month of July and the end of October is when you must have your annual meeting. And Steve, I think about from our experience, when we have our annual meeting in August, we always remind ourselves that even though our Board of Education sits at the front with Dr. Solero and myself, we remind ourselves that an annual meeting is not a meeting of the board. It's actually a meeting of the electorate. And so we go to board meetings, a couple of times a month, and the school board members sit up front and they do their business. And there's, from time to time, there's people in the crowd and we're all there. That is a meeting of the board. But again, the annual meeting, even though it looks like it is a board meeting, the way it's set up, the reality is it's actually a meeting of the electorate. The electorate are the ones that receive the budget presentation. The electorate are the ones that can adopt a proposed tax levy.
Scott, Catherine had a question. Catherine, would you mind sharing that with the team?
Sure. You mentioned, I think, more in step 2 of how you have to post it a certain amount of days beforehand, or when you have to put it, I think, in the paper. Do those deadlines change often where you have to constantly look at the DPI website to know, or do they relatively stay the same?
They relatively stay the same. It's a great question. Thanks for asking. Fortunately for us, they typically stay the same, which is really helpful. We probably would be walking on pins and needles every year, making sure that we meet whatever the new requirement is. But generally speaking, they stay the same, and that's really helpful for us. And there's really two things that we post. One is notice, just letting the public know, hey, here's our annual meeting, here's the date and time of it. We post that twice leading up to the annual meeting. And then the second item we post is the actual budget itself. And there's a format that we have to follow. We share with the community what the actual budget looks like. And ours was just in our newspaper last week, Steve. So thank you for pointing that out to me.
Yes, thank you for posting it. Now, Angelie, you have a couple of thoughtful questions too. Won't you please share them?
Yes, so I'm just thinking about the magnitude of work that you're describing, and it seems like a lot. So I guess I was wondering, either at your school district or what you know about other school districts in the state, is this like primarily your responsibility? Do you have a team of people that helps you? I kind of was talking to some of my other colleagues in one of our groups about like perhaps people in finance departments in like smaller school districts may not have all the resources or knowledge to do a lot of these things. So is there occasions where school districts ever outsource this work to other like firms or accountants?
Great question. I'll tackle it from a couple different angles. First, I'm not aware of districts that have outsourced these requirements to, an outside firm. I have heard of a few business managers, maybe, that retire and maybe they get contacted by a smaller district to say, hey, can you come in for whatever reason? Can you come in and help us with our annual meeting, help us with our budget development? That said, I remember back when I started in the school business management world, and what I found with some of my classmates at Whitewater back in the day is they found themselves applying to smaller schools. And when they were applying to smaller schools, all of a sudden it dawned on them, okay, wait a minute here, I'm fresh out of school. And if I go to a smaller district, to your point, that has a lot less staff, it really means that you're taking on the responsibility, starting at a small school district, to wear a lot of hats. And that includes things like managing this. The person that's doing this kind of work might also be the person that's running payroll every couple of weeks. And if I think about somebody that goes into the superintendent route and they start at a really small district, they may not even have a business manager that is doing some of this work. Their payroll person is most likely their bookkeeper, the person that's paying the bills and recording receipts and balancing checking accounts every month and that kind of thing. That really can put a big responsibility on a superintendent to do some of these higher level budgeting activities that normally in a bigger district, you would have multiple people that are trained and focused just on those tasks. And Steve, you're obviously actively involved in the superintendent's group, and I would have to imagine from your experience, business manager or superintendents that start in small districts, if they came from areas that aren't from the business side of the house, it might be a challenging couple of years to roll their sleeves up and figure out how some of this stuff works. And so, Angelie, thanks for the question. I would say, again, I don't see a lot of districts outsourcing. I have seen a few business managers step in and help out districts, maybe that lost somebody at the 11th hour or has somebody new that came in and didn't have the experience they needed to do it. But again, if you're a superintendent in a smaller district, I have to believe that it would be a bit challenging. I would say it'd be like this. I've worked in the business office for a long time, about 20 years. If I moved into the superintendent world at a small district, I would have the budget components tied up, no problem. But if it came to things that some of you are very familiar with that I'm not, things like student discipline, statutes relating to things that happen in the classroom and in the school buildings, that's a world that I don't live in every day, and I would be seeking help in those areas. So I think we all have our expertise and our forte, but boy, yeah, smaller districts, you absolutely would find yourself needing support from others to try to learn new tasks. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you. I
Okay.
was just curious about like outside services. I guess more so my last district, when they were audited, they were using like certified accountants to kind of audit, like help them audit all their statements and stuff.
If I could just take another 30 seconds to that point,
Mhm.
that would be great. So one of the things that public schools have every year is an independent auditor enter the district and review the financial transactions for the previous school year. And so we had our audit a couple of weeks ago. We do ours pretty early in July. And so if you ever hear that your district's being audited, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It happens every single year, including here. It actually, while it can be stressful, it's also a good thing, because I think from the perspective of using public dollars, having independent people come in and look over our work, as stressful as it can be, it ensures the public that we're doing things correctly and accurately. Yeah. So that's not something that, even if I had my CPA license, that's not something that Mount Horeb schools could rely on me to do, because essentially I'd be auditing my own work. And you would want somebody from the outside come in and do that.
Thank you. That makes sense. That's separate from the budget.
Great. Other questions? So that's the exciting world of annual meetings. So if you have an opportunity to attend an annual meeting, either at your current district or maybe the district that you live in, do it. Hopefully you'll find it valuable and put some perspective in some of the things that are happening in your district.
I do have one question.
Please.
We reached out to our director of business services about when Menasha's annual meeting is. And he said that we don't have annual meetings because we're a unified school district, but they do have like a budget meeting. Is that something that the community still comes to and participates in? It's just maybe called something different.
Yes, very good point. So I just scrolled my screen a little bit. You'll see where my mouse is. It says Common School District, and then it says Unified School District, sort of in the center. So unified school districts operate a little bit differently than common school districts. I've always lived in the world of common school districts and the annual meetings that we're required to have. I have not been to an annual meeting for a unified school district, although I do believe that there is, and I would expect that there would be public input on that type of meeting. But that's fascinating, because there are definitely, and you'll see this just in posting notice of such a meeting, that common school districts have different criteria that we need to follow than a unified. So Menasha is a unified. Okay, that's interesting. I wish I could share more insight on the specifics with unified, but I just don't have a lot of experience with them.
I'd be curious to go back and look at maybe one of their videos of one of their meetings to see how they differ from a traditional K-12 school district. Thanks for teaching me something today.
You could make your conclusion watching it, which format you like better. Oh, common schools really sound like that might be the way to go, or a unified. Any other questions? I appreciate them for sure. Okay. So what I'm going to do is stop sharing just for a second, and I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint. Okay. Everybody see this okay? So number 3 is tax levy adoption. So let's talk about tax levy for a second. So you may recall on the expenditure side of the house, I said usually around 80 to 85% of the school district's budget is wages and benefits, personnel, right? We're a service-oriented industry. On the revenue side of the house, so again, in a budget, we have expenditures and we have revenues, and without revenues, we're in trouble. Revenues help define what it is we can afford to do on the expenditure side. In Mount Horeb, our tax levy and the amount of aid we get from the state, so those 2 buckets, our tax levy, okay, people pay their property tax bills each year, and a portion of those tax bills goes to the school district. So the tax levy bucket and then the state aid bucket, how much money the state of Wisconsin is willing to give each and every school district to have a budget. Those 2 buckets in Mount Horeb, when we add those together, is about 90% of our total revenue. So at 90% of our total revenue, taxes, state aid. That's important when we think about the adoption of our tax levy. When we go to our annual meeting in August, as I mentioned earlier, there's some projections that we make, variables that we don't know yet. One of those variables, again, for us, the month of August, is we don't officially know what that 3rd Friday enrollment count in September will be. So we have to project a number. Are we going to stay the same? Do we think we'll go down, or do we think we'll increase in students? Because that has a direct impact on our funding, we don't want to miss the boat too bad on our projection. In Mount Horeb, where we have about 2,400 students, if we projected a obnoxious number, a 400 student increase, it could have a dramatic effect on our budget. We'd have, a lot more revenue coming in, we could increase our expenditures, and then all of a sudden our actual enrollment occurs in September and we're scratching our head and we would say, gosh, we have to now cut a lot of dollars, which is, I've never experienced that, but you can only imagine how challenging that would be if you're not conservative with your enrollment projection. So at our annual meeting, enrollment has a direct connect to what our tax levy will be. And so as a result of that, the electorate at the annual meeting adopt a proposed tax levy. But when we get to the end of October is when we, as school districts, officially adopt our tax levy. At that particular time, what the Board of Education essentially is saying is, we are going to revise that tax levy to the levy that's allowed under revenue limits now. We'll talk a little bit more about revenue limits in a bit. But needless to say, I wanted to point out that at the annual meeting, the electorate does adopt a proposed tax levy, but that can be subject to change once we find out our enrollment in the fall. And then the board considers an official tax levy at the end of October. The next item is just the budget calendar, as I mentioned earlier. When we create a budget calendar in the district, I always like to work backwards. We know that we have to adopt our tax levy, our official tax levy, at the end of October. We know that we will determine our enrollment in September. We know that we'll have our annual meeting, at least in Mount Horeb, in August. We know that we have our audit in July. We know that our fiscal year starts on July 1st. And we just start going backwards all the way to the previous school year when the board starts working on its budget in December, January, February, March range. And the reason why I work backwards is we can't adopt a tax levy in October if we don't have our enrollment counts in our annual meeting in August. So all those important variables need to take place in order for us to be successful. And so that's really the purpose for me to have a budget calendar, is just to remind people, especially our Board of Education. They're great. We have a great Board of Education, However, they don't do this every single day, right? They have their own livelihoods and their own work. And so it's always important for me to do my due diligence to remind them of those dates. And then it's like, oh yeah, that's right. That's why we need to make this decision today, so that next month we can do this, we can do that. I'll stop right there. We're at the end of our important dates. Any thoughts or questions or comments? One thing I have to say about school finance, and I jokingly say this to people, is some people either have a vested interest in this topic and they're like, hey, I'm all in. Or they're like, whoa, wait a minute here. I'm glad there's people that do this, but this really isn't my forte. So just know that as I talk about these variables, I know people are thinking both sides of it, and that's great. That's okay. That's natural. I just want you to at least be exposed to some of the day-to-day stuff that we do in a business office. So district practices and procedures. So 3 items that I just want to share with you. Some of you have probably tremendous amount of experience in these areas. And the first one is building and department level budgeting. Some people love budgeting. Some people hate when budget time happens in their buildings or their departments or their classrooms and their offices. But really the detailed activities that happen even at a building level and a classroom level are so significantly important to our overall budget. We want kids to be successful. We want our staff and our buildings to be successful. And one of those areas to ensuring that to happen is for them to have the resources they need to follow through with that. So it's important for us to provide support to our building principals, who in return can provide support to their staff as they start working on their budgets for the upcoming year. You could probably have a semester-long class just on different ways that a school district could budget, whether it's school-based budgeting, it's zero-based budgeting. There's all different models for how to budget. But I always just hope that at the end of the day, whatever budget model works for a district, that they recognize that the goals that the building and the district has need to be supported with the resources to make that happen. In other words, we always say, if you want to look at where a district is putting its dollars, look at its strategic plan. Because if they're recognizing and keeping the strategic plan out in front of them, that should be where they're putting their dollars. Software utilization. The next one is simply, as I mentioned earlier, Skyward is a common one. I think Alio is a CISA supported software. Some of you might have experience with Alio, but obviously the software that you use to manage your budget is mission critical. I love Microsoft Excel. I use Excel every day, but somebody who is relying on Excel to do budget kind of work on a day-to-day basis is missing the boat. There's financial software like Skyward that does the work for you. And then district-defined deadlines. We provide deadlines to our buildings and our departments as to when they need to have their budgets into the business office. It allows me to start to put the numbers together to see if we have shortfalls and if there's any additional decisions we need to make. I'm very fortunate in Mount Horeb. We have people that are really good at hitting deadlines, which is significantly beneficial for us to make sure there's no surprises in the budget. So my recommendation is to always pay attention to deadlines that your district gives you.
May I interrupt you real quick and also give you an opportunity to grab a drink? One of those deadlines we're often familiar with as educators is the deadline to purchase items before the school year is out. Can you talk about why that deadline is important for the school district when you say, oh, last opportunity to purchase for the 2021-22 school year?
So one of the things, thanks for asking. So one of the things that we try to do is when we get to the month of May, we're looking for people to do exactly what Dr. Salerno just mentioned, is start slowing down your purchases. Now, I know as a business manager, I can't just put a cutoff of April 30th, you're done, you can't spend another dollar, because school's still in session for the month of May and part of June. And there might be experiments and there's field trips and there's all kinds of things that need to happen. So generally speaking, if it comes to more bigger kind of purchases, we really want people to make those in the spring prior to that deadline. One thing that I learned over the years is auditors can get a little crabby. Some are more patient than others, but auditors can get a little strange sometimes if all of a sudden a district on June 20th decided to buy, gosh, I don't know, $120,000 worth of new curriculum for the upcoming school year. They would say, wait a minute, June 20th, you made this purchase, but it's for next school year. You really need to move that expenditure into next fiscal year. And then a district might say, well, wait a minute, but we had dollars remaining in our budget. We wanted to be able to buy it now. And in a practical sense, it makes all the sense in the world, in my opinion. But from an auditor's point of view, wait a minute, you're using it for next year. You really can't buy it on June 20th. You need to put it to the next fiscal year. So from an audit point of view, making those purchases prior to a deadline in the spring is important so that we don't get caught in sort of a pickle with auditors. Generally speaking, though, outside of the audit world, if people are making purchases up to a certain deadline in the spring, what it allows a building to do and the district to do is to say, okay, do we have funds remaining in aggregate across the district where we can do something for the betterment of the district? You know, one year it might be, hey, there's some dollars remaining. So the high school will use X number of dollars to, you know, make a purchase in their building that supports kids. You know, so not only at the district level are we concerned about where we're landing with our budget, but even within a building, we've had principals say, hey, you know what? Teachers bought everything they needed to for the year. We're now past the deadline. We have X number of dollars remaining in our budget. Let's purchase that one item that can be shared across classrooms that we just typically can't seem to ever fit into our budget. And then we were able to make some pretty cool purchases. And if we do it in the spring and we're not getting into that June 20th date, it usually works out pretty well. So there's some rhyme and reason of why we have those kinds of deadlines. It really allows us to, in a selfish world, allows me to see where we're going to land for a year. But it also allows our buildings and departments to sometimes make purchases that maybe they can't squeeze into a normal budget. Other thoughts or comments or questions on deadlines? Okay. So forecasting. So one of the things that districts, especially right now, I would say probably more than ever, rely on budget forecasting. Budget forecasting in schools is interesting because it's not like we work in an industry where we can change our product flow and we can update our prices and change the way our sales force does things to try to increase, you know, business. Obviously, that's not the world that we live in. So budget forecasting for us are things like personnel increases, you know, such as wages and health insurance, future enrollments. Do we see any growth in our district? And what we're finding as a school district in Mount Horeb is not only we, but neighboring districts are considering operational referenda. If they haven't done it in the past, they're maybe thinking about it potentially in the near future as early as this coming fall. And when that happens, what a district is doing is they're looking at forecasts and realizing that based on the potential of getting X amount of funds from the state, we may find ourselves in a shortfall. And the only way for a school district to bring in a significant amount of additional dollars into its operating budget to make ends meet is to go to referendum. And a referendum, as most of you probably know, it's a request from a school district to the community, to the public, saying, if you say yes to our operational referendum question, we will be allowed as a district to raise your taxes by a certain amount in order to do the initiatives that we're talking about. It might be wage increases, it might be renovations to school buildings, et cetera. So forecasting is really important because we don't want to be caught in a situation at the 11th hour where we're just realizing, gosh, we just don't have funds to even make ends meet for the upcoming year. But as I mentioned a few times in the past, just this morning, our forecasting is truly based on projections. And sometimes projections can be difficult, so you have to be conservative with your projections. So you hope you can hit the mark. Any thoughts or comments on things that you're seeing in your neck of the woods, in your districts or your communities about referenda happening, or things that you're hearing about referenda? I'm always curious to hear around the state what's cooking in the world of school referendums.
Menasha is building a new middle school, but their motto to the community is that they won't be raising property taxes. I think because they're going to be maintaining their property taxes from the previous referendum that was passed. So I think they're using that, and hopefully we can get some new facilities built.
Well, it sounds like a pretty nice opportunity if you can, do something building related and not seeing much at all or any of an impact on taxes. If you have the opportunity to go down that road, boy, that's a wonderful thing, isn't it? We can build a new building and not see a change in taxes. Thanks for sharing. That's interesting. Yeah. And by the way, if you're saying, well, gosh, how does that work? If I build a new house, I'm going to increase my budget at home. So how can a district do such a thing? Well, sometimes, and I can't speak on behalf of Menasha, and Brian, who's in Menasha, probably would slap me for even making a comment because it's totally guess on my part. But sometimes when a district has debt from previous referenda, they see themselves either paying off debt or maybe they just paid off some debt, and so the levy was expected to maybe go down. You insert a new school building into that debt, and maybe you're back to where you were, and you really won't see much of an impact on it. So there are pretty creative things that districts can do sometimes to make a levy as stable as possible and still meet some of its goals. So interesting. Thanks, Kristen. Okay, we'll move on from forecasting then. How are we doing? Everybody okay? We are at 11:10. Steve, are we okay on your end?
Yes, we are, and we're doing great. I was just looking at the chat, and it looks like Anna had mentioned that they're closing 2 buildings in order to help offset costs in that effort.
This is a good teachable moment for me. I need to pay attention to my chats. So thank you, Steve, for that. And everybody, thank you for your patience. Yeah, I have not been in a situation where I worked in a district where they were looking at closing a building. I can only imagine some of the variables that come into play in a community when you've had a school there for a long period of time. So that's certainly interesting. And of course, building new buildings, elementary, middle school, a pool, Wanakee. Wanakee is interesting because they're not far from us, but boy, the growth that they've experienced and the facilities and things that they've been able to do, it's like, wow, it's always a wonderful opportunity when you see growth in your district for a variety of reasons, but certainly comes with capacity challenges and other types of things and boundaries and so forth. So thank you for sharing that.
Scott, how would you address a budgetary deficit perhaps a large one, perhaps a $10 million deficit.
Ooh, 10 million, now you're making me sweat.
Yeah.
So for a district of Mount Horeb size, just kind of put it in perspective, our general fund, our general budget is about $28 million. So in terms of ratio, if I'm in Madison and I see a $10 million, it might mean something different than, Mount Horeb, which would be like a third, right? So a couple of things. Well, one, if we're projecting a significant deficit, we probably found that through some type of budget forecasting. That's how we got there, right? Then we look at the budget forecast and we say, okay, where are we finding our challenges? Well, on the surface, since I had mentioned that the vast majority of our expenditure budget is personnel, it's that how do we treat our personnel and make them valued and provide them with the compensation that they need and the benefits that they need, and to allow us to do it in a way that makes us competitive with our surrounding districts. Because quite frankly, we are in the same market with other Madison area districts when it comes to hiring. So that is always a really important factor, and Steve can attest to this, that we pay attention to. We want to be able to take care of the people in our district, and we want to also remain competitive with our neighbors. So how we would address it is a couple of things. First, it's the communication of it. How in the world do we communicate that we have a projected challenge here? So we would work through our committees, such as our finance committee is probably the one that would hit closest to home. We would communicate with our finance committee, which again, a few board members are on our finance committee. We would talk about what some of those challenges are and what our deficit looks like. The great thing about having a subcommittee of the board like a finance committee is it gives those interested board members that serve on that committee an opportunity to talk in a little bit more detail about financial items. Sometimes at a board level, there's so many bigger things than, they don't always have an opportunity or the time to dive into details. So communication would be really important, and finance committee would certainly be a good start. As I mentioned earlier, we have some workshops throughout the year where the board has an opportunity to sit down and talk about some very specific items that, again, it may not be able to address at a normal traditional school board meeting. So that'd be the next most important item, is to communicate with our Board of Education what our challenges are. And then it comes to, once those discussions happen, do we feel that we're able to find a means through our administrative team to come up with answers to those shortfalls? And as an administrative team, if that's not something that we feel that we can handle on our own, that at that point, the board needs to start addressing what types of difficult decisions do you make versus do we want to maintain what we currently are doing and maybe add to what we're currently doing to enhance our educational system through the form of some type of operational referendum. And then at that particular point, the board adopts a resolution and informs the community that it would like to go to referendum. Again, typically it means, not always, but typically it means some type of increase in property tax. And then you find out from the community after the vote if that's something that they supported. We in Mount Horeb, and I'm sure you've seen this in your districts, worked with a company that created a community survey where we're able to send a survey out to our community, and they give us feedback on, what our shortfalls are and what we're hoping to try to enhance and not only maintain, but enhance our educational programs. And we got positive feedback, and surveys are a really, really important thing for a school district to help it make a decision if it went to referendum that the community would support it. Now, nothing's a guarantee, but to the degree that we can continue to get feedback from our community on things that we're doing is certainly helpful. So to your good question of a significant shortfall, what in the world do we do? the worst thing we do is nothing. Because that's not going to go away. Communication is key with all stakeholders, not just at the building level, not just the administrative level and the board level, but with the community. We need to be able to communicate. As comfortable as some of those things, uncomfortable as some of those things might be, communication is so mission critical. Yeah. That's about as direct of an answer as I could give.
Thank you. I did put in the chat another question, just following up on what you were saying. Is there like a separate department for public relations or communications that would deliver that kind of sensitive information?
Fantastic question.
You
Boy, would it
collaborate?
be amazing if we started, boy, we may have actually tossed that around every once in a while. Boy, that would be nice if we had such a system. We don't have a department like that here in Mount Horeb. And I would guess if we don't have one, as you look at districts that get smaller and smaller and smaller than Mount Horeb, that person may be the superintendent, business manager, some school board members, or hiring an outside firm. That might be a case where you do some outsourcing. For example, when we created the survey, we created it through the help of a company that we hired, an expert that is that's what they do, is create community surveys. So that's an example of outsourcing. Ideally, yes, there would be a separate department that can be that communication, somebody that has a communication background, somebody that's strategic in how you get information out to the community. Larger districts, maybe even some districts Mount Horeb size, may have those kinds of positions. We don't currently, but boy, it'd be I can't imagine the level of benefit that districts that have those types of departments see in terms of messaging. I won't ask Steve to comment, but I can only imagine, and I see from time to time the amount of time that he as a superintendent puts in to communication and messaging. Sometimes I think it's, takes up the vast majority of his day, simply because we know how important that communication is. I'm reading I will always remember my mom showing me a comment card from a survey my home district did before a referendum. It just said, no bigger building. One thing I can say about buildings is you need electricity, you need heat, you need air conditioning, and you need some people to keep them clean. And the bigger they get, the more there's a need. Yep. Thanks for your comments and thoughts. Anybody else? Okay. So we'll move on to revenue limits. How many of you have heard of revenue limits? Thumbs up, thumbs down. No thumb sideways. That means you don't care. Up or down, you've heard of it, you've not heard of it? Okay. Okay. So revenue limits, you may not be aware of this. They came into play back in 1993. And the idea behind revenue limits is the state wanted to control or limit the amount of revenue that a district could receive in any given year from state aid and property taxes. I used to have people tell me when I first started in Mount Horeb back in 2009, gosh, I remember back in the day before revenue limits, we'd get so many more people attend our annual meeting. Well, and the reason for that was before revenue limits, a school district at its annual meeting could adopt a tax levy simply to support what its initiatives were. And so if the electorate approved such a thing, and the Board of Education approved such a thing, you could adopt a property tax that supported what you needed. So in 93, when revenue limits came into play, the state simply said, for Mount Horeb schools, 90% of our revenue is state aid and property tax. That tells us that we have a constraint on 90% of our revenue, which is why districts and, the vast majority of districts over the last number of years have gone to referendum, and not only for building, but also for operational, simply because that restriction prevents them from being able to raise taxes without getting community support through a referendum. When revenue limits went into place, it obviously had a direct impact on district budgets. And I put there at the bottom of the slide, winners versus losers, and I'll give you an example just from a Mount Horeb perspective. We in Mount Horeb were a very low spending district prior to revenue limits. And what that simply means is the district generally just didn't spend a lot of money. And when revenue limits were put into place, the statute said that districts, based on what your current budgets were and what you currently were spending, that was your starting point. Districts that were higher spending districts had a much higher revenue limit when the statute began. So sort of the winner loser thing in my mind is simply that districts that were spending more, that were higher spending districts, were in a little bit different place than districts like Mount Horeb that were a low spending district. Because if we were a low spending district and they didn't give us any opportunity to sort of catch up, what it really caused us to do is we knew moving forward that a district low spending, if you wanted to add some of the additional pieces into your budget, like some of the other districts, most likely we may have to go to referendum in order to accomplish that task. So again, if nothing else, just keep in mind that back in '93, when they came into place, the purpose of revenue limits was simply just to control or limit the amount of money that we could receive in state aid and property tax. Now, I don't want to put the fear in you, but I do want you to at least get an opportunity to see what a revenue limit worksheet looks like. This is not something that I created. I can't take credit for it, even if I wanted to. But a revenue limit worksheet is something that every public school district will use to help determine, again, in our case, 90% of our budget, 90% of our revenue, property tax and state aid. So I'm going to share this with them. I'm going to click on the link here, and I share this with you. I'm going to DPI's website. So excuse me just a second here. Does everybody see revenue limit worksheets? Great. So in this screen, you can scroll down and there's other sources here for revenue limits. I'm going to pull up the revenue limit worksheet and I'll use it for Mount Horeb. If you're able to find this separately in a separate page, you're welcome to look up your own revenue limit worksheet in the community you live in or the school district that you work in. Are you able to see this Excel document okay? No? I need to share it again. Yeah.
I think you have to click the, there you go.
Yeah. So this is a revenue limit worksheet. It looks a little bit overwhelming because the font is small and there's so much information on the page. But you'll see, I'm going to increase this a bit. This is a pre-populated worksheet, and you'll see here in this little drop down, I can go to any school district I want, and it goes in alphabetical order. Of course, I'm going to cheat and go to the district that I know most about, which is Mount Horeb. I'll choose that. And what it does is it pre-fills data, and we actually will use this worksheet to help make projections for our upcoming budget. And again, this is for the 22-23 budget year. So again, July 1st was the start of our fiscal year. We're now August 2nd, so we're a month into our fiscal year. But we really won't put the finishing details on our budget again till around Halloween time at the end of October. What this worksheet does is it allows us to make some assumptions right now. And then ultimately, based on those assumptions, it'll tell us what our tax levy is. So if nothing else, what I would like you to get from this is how we calculate our tax levy. And I'm going to just point out a couple of places where I'm just going to punch in some numbers and you'll just see how this thing calculates. Again, my goal is not for you to be passionate or understand the details of how this all works. I just want you to know that this tool exists and there's a place where you can go and look up your own district and see information. Wherever there's numbers in these cells, some of them don't apply to Mount Horeb. Some of them are pre-filled from previous years. And this particular area right here is where we put in our enrollment projections for the upcoming year. And so you'll see some information here for the 2019 school year, what our enrollment numbers look like, our 2020 school year, our 2021 school year. But then you'll see down here, 2022, we don't have any data in there yet. And it's simply because our third Friday count in September hasn't happened. So we need to project some numbers to come up with what we comfortably think it could be. So for sake of conversation today, let's just say that we're going to project a stable enrollment. We're not going to see any change. Is that practical? Probably not. We're going to go up, we're going to go down. In fact, we projected a slight decrease in our enrollment. But nevertheless, I'm just going to put in a couple numbers here. So we're going to say that our summer, we have a summer school, and I'm sure many of your districts have summer school as well. When I put in the number 20, it doesn't mean we only had 20 kids attend our summer school. There's a calculation that determines how much credit we get for the amount of kids that we serve in summer school. And it's based on the number of minutes. X number of minutes equals 1 student. So last year we were at 20. So we'll project another 20 for this upcoming year. You'll see, gosh, what happened in 2020? The pandemic happened. We didn't have much in summer school that year, but we went back up to 20 last summer. We'll say we're at 20 this summer. Our September count, this line right here, our September count, for sake of conversation, we'll just say that will remain at 2,285 students. Okay. And I won't get into these details, but I'll just put in a number to make it consistent. So what you'll find is, based on our enrollment numbers here, we can move forward on the right side of the screen. So I'm going to kind of split this in half. This is sort of the working side. And over here is what I call the calculation side. The vast majority of the data on the working side was already pre-filled for us. All we did is just entered in numbers for our enrollment, and that was it. We don't have to do anything else over there. On the calculation side, this is where we're getting at, okay, we need to figure out a tax levy. What in the world are we going to do in Mount Horeb? How do we calculate this thing? So we go to this worksheet. We put in our enrollments, okay? Then down at the bottom here, there's 2 types of tax levies. So for those of you that are homeowners, you get your property tax bill in the mail and you see your county's collecting money from you, the state's collecting money from you. Maybe you have a community college or a technical college, and then you have a school district. So for a school district, when we adopt a levy, there's a few things that make up that levy. And for us, our Fund 10 budget, which we call our general operating fund, our general fund budget is the budget that we call keep our lights on. It keeps our lights on, it pays our people, it removes snow, it mows grass. All of those keeps our athletic department going. all those things that we do to keep our lights on, that's our general operating fund. Well, there's a tax levy that goes with keeping the lights on. And after we entered our enrollment for this upcoming fall, again, our projection, it gave us a number right here. So I'm in column K. And specifically this number right here, 9,319,799. By just putting in an enrollment projection, the revenue limit just said, okay, based on your enrollment projection, here's the amount that you can levy for your keeping the lights on budget. And so we call that our Fund 10 levy. And so what I would say is, I'm going to type in that 93,19,799. And what we're essentially saying is the revenue limit saying we can levy 9.3 million. So we're going to actually levy 9.3 million. Okay, we're going to levy what the revenue limit's allowing us to levy. Okay, there may be strategic times that school districts say, hey, you know what? We're not going to levy to our fullest. We're going to levy something a little bit less. But for conversation today, in this kind of fillable space, we're going to say that we're levying what the revenue limit is going to allow us to levy. Okay. Now we'll go to this next area here. This is also another very common levy. So again, the first levy is keep the lights on levy, our general fund levy. The second levy is all the districts around the state that have gone to referendum in the past to build new buildings, build a new middle school, build a new high school, do something that is a building project. They went to referendum to build a new middle school. The community said, yes, we approve you building a new middle school. We heard this morning that you sometimes could do that maybe without seeing an increase in your levy. Generally speaking, I think it's safe to say that a district would see some type of increase in its levy. So we call that our mortgage payment. So for those of you that own a house and you have a mortgage, each month you make a mortgage payment to your bank. And it's both principal and interest, right? That's how the bank makes money off its interest. So our referendum debt, our referendum levy is simply our mortgage payment. We have mortgage payments that we have to make to pay off the building that we just built. And the community said, through the approval of the referendum, we will allow you to raise our taxes to pay for that building. Now we have to make our mortgage payments. So we have to levy the amount of our mortgage payments so we make the bank happy. So each district will have a different mortgage payment. And so for Mount Horeb schools, I'm going to say that our Mount Horeb mortgage is $5 million. So we have a $5 million mortgage payment that we have to make for the upcoming year. Okay. And what the revenue limit worksheet just did is it took our keep the lights on budget levy, 9.3 million, and our debt service levy or our mortgage payment levy of 5 million, and added these two numbers together. And you'll see this number down here, column K right here, 14,319,799. If I were to go to an annual meeting today using this enrollment information and not changing anything else in the worksheet, our projected tax levy for this upcoming school year would be this $14.3 million number. I won't get into mill rates because mill rate's a whole nother kind of separate calculation, but I just wanted to point out to you that based on DPI providing us with a revenue limit worksheet, this is how a district would go in and actually calculate its tax levy. I'll stop right there. And there's a lot of lines with a lot of data and a lot of cells that I skipped over. But for conversation's sake, those are really the most important variables. You put in an enrollment, you see what the revenue limit allows, you determine how much you're going to levy in your lights on and what your mortgage payment is, and ultimately that calculates your tax levy. I'll stop right there and just hear if there's any questions for thoughts. It's a lot to throw at you, I understand, and I certainly appreciate your attention. If you're an Excel person or a spreadsheet person, you might like this stuff. Else you might get glossy-eyed after seeing this. I will tell you, when I went into grad school and I started looking at this for the first time, it was like, whoa, there's a lot going on here.
Scott,
Please.
you talked a little bit about like enrollment and how that kind of contributes to your projections. So when I was thinking about my old school district, the cause of their $10 million deficit was because I attribute it to the immense loss of enrollment. I think there was over like 1,000 students that enrolled out of the district. So they recently adopted a new budget, and Steve kind of talked about the dangers of using ESSER funds to supply salaries, and that's what they're doing. So what does that mean? Like when a district is in a pinch like that, what does that mean for the future when you're using funds like that? Like what sort of things do you have to do to keep the lights on, I guess, after making a decision like that?
Another great question. So I think for a district that chooses to use one-time dollars, it sounds like you've talked about this a little bit already. For a district that uses one-time dollars for recurring costs, they're setting themselves up for one of two things. This is my opinion. They're either setting themselves up for significant challenges in the future. Maybe they have some insight into some additional funding that might be coming their way down the road. If it's dependent on, what might be happening at the state in terms of school funding for the future. Certainly a district could always project that it'll receive an increase in state funding of some sort. But being that it would only be a projection, certainly would hope that the district would be insightful enough to at least understand that projection could change if reality says something different. So I'm sure every district has these types of intimate discussions about the use of ESSER dollars. First of all, what the ESSER dollars are allowed to be used for, of course, that goes without saying. But that aside, using ESSER dollars for recurring expenses like personnel costs, it's not that it couldn't be done, but they would just have to tackle it with a lot of sensitivity. And because we would hate for that district in 2 to 3 years from now, not have a game plan to continue with those recurring costs when the funding's gone. That's a tough one. I'm sure most districts around have had those exact discussions of what we use ESSER dollars for to improve our educational system. But when it finds itself being in shortfalls from a budget point of view, finding out a way to make ends meet with one-time dollars can get you through the next year or two, but there could be challenges if they don't have a plan to get out of that. Wish I had a much more direct, clear answer than that. That's where I will just add, that's where budget forecasting becomes so critical. They might find that, maybe one of their answers is we'll go to operational referendum. If we don't get the funding that we need, they hit the shortfall when the time comes. That might be something that they have in their plans.
Any other observations or questions we have while we're fortunate to have Scott with us this afternoon? Your questions are so insightful, team. It speaks to your understanding of where we're at so far. Tomorrow, we'll actually spend some time together working on an actual project where you're going to be tasked with having to cut and you're going to pretend that you're the district senior leadership team having to make those cuts. But before we do that, Scott, can you introduce us to account codes and the WUFAR?
Sure. So you may have heard of the acronym WUFAR. It used to be called the WESIS, oh gosh, a decade or two ago. But it's basically an accounting system that we use in the state, in schools. And I jokingly said it earlier this morning that, boy, who created this whole accounting structure thing? Just know that it's a statewide uniform system that we all use for not only practical day-to-day things, but also for reporting to the state. I won't get into, I won't go to the link, but there is a link here to look at this, 80 to 100 page document of account codes. If you're an accountant or you teach accounting or you have any experience with accounting, you'll appreciate that. Just know that there is a document out there for districts to follow. And DPI has really been cracking down on school districts that kind of want to do their own thing. They'll follow the system, but they'll kind of create their own codes and do their own thing. That really does not work for DPI when they're receiving reports and data from us. So DPI has been kind of cracking the point of, guys, come on, people, you need to be using our system, because submitting data to us with using the wrong account codes doesn't work for us. So there's that. I just wanted to point out fund balance, and I'll take, promise, 30 seconds on the fund balance piece. You may have heard the concept of fund balance. Fund balance is sometimes a common item that districts talk about. I just wanted to point out that fund balance is really an accounting number. Sometimes people think that fund balance is a savings account down at your local bank. I wish it was, that'd be great. But fund balance is really an accounting number that helps us essentially determine the financial health of our district as one component. And so the best way that I can describe it is this. At the end of each year, when the district's budget is done, we're June 30th, end of the fiscal year, a district will look at all of its revenues. It'll look at all of its expenditures. And unless everything matches literally to the penny, okay, revenue is either going to exceed expenditures or expenditures are going to exceed revenues. Hopefully revenues exceed expenditures for the year, so you didn't go in the hole. So what happens at the end of the year, if you have more revenues than expenditures, this is more of an accounting idea. If revenues are greater than expenditures, that number, that difference, is what becomes your fund balance. So if revenues are greater than expenditures by 100,000, your fund balance at the end of the year is 100,000. And the next year, if you do the exact same thing all over again, and your revenues are greater than your expenditures by 100,000, your fund balance is now 200,000 because it adds from the previous year. So every district has different fund balances, and DPI actually has a site. I won't go to it for the sake of time, but they have a site where it actually addresses how much is too much fund balance. And DPI's message is always, you have enough fund balance to show the financial health of your district, as long as you don't have to borrow money during the school year to make ends meet. And I'll stop by saying this, because fund balance is not cash, it's just an accounting equation. Cash is what actually pays our bills. So when we get our health insurance bill every month and our dental insurance bill every month, and we're making payrolls every month, and we're paying bills across the board every month, we need enough cash in our checking account to support those checks. It's kind of like at home, right? You buy things with your debit card, but eventually you need to pay attention that you have enough money in your checking account to support those purchases. It's no different than us. And so there are times in the year where a district's cash on hand can be pretty low, because maybe, we're just not getting enough money coming in at certain times of the year. We'll get all the revenue that we budgeted for, but sometimes it may be a couple of months where we're not getting much cash coming in. And so when districts fall into that issue, sometimes they have to borrow money from a bank. I don't know if you've ever heard that, But there are districts in the state that have to borrow money, sort of like a line of credit, to make payroll, to make ends meet until they have tax and state support coming in, to be able to have enough cash flow once again. So DPI will always say that the amount of fund balance that you have is great, but you really need to pay attention to how much cash you have in the bank, because at the end of the day, you got to make sure you can make all your obligations. So I'll stop right there, and just ask if there are any questions. And again, if you find an interest in some of this, wonderful. If you don't, thank you for giving me some of your attention this morning. And just know that there are certain tools and things on DPI's website that business offices in each school district use to help, do their jobs and do things correctly.
Any last minute questions for Scott? A lot was covered in a short period of time, but one of the things that we talked about, Scott, yesterday was taking some of these complex topics and trying to put them in simple terms. And you've done that so well today. We're so appreciative of that. Won't you all please join me in giving a round of applause to Scott? Yeah.
Thank you. You are way too kind.
Yeah.
I love having the opportunity to speak about this, but I'm always afraid I don't do justice to the number of topics to address in a very short amount of time. So thank you for your kindness.
We did give you a tall order, and as usual, Scott, you went above and beyond the call of duty. Thank you so much for your leadership. Scott, I might just give you a buzz here on my drive down to UW campus before my 1 o'clock to talk about a couple of those other items that I sent you an email.
Sounds great.
That'd be great. Thank you so much, Scott. I'll try to give you a buzz maybe about 12:15 or so.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody. It was nice to meet you. Best wishes on your classes in your upcoming school year.